She locked the door that night, believing she was safe. By morning, investigators believed someone had entered the house anyway. No shattered windows, no loud struggle, no neighbors waking up to screams. Just an elderly woman, disappearing from her own home without explanation. And the deeper people looked into the Nancy Guthrie case, the more disturbing it became. Because this case was never only about someone going missing. It was about timing, control, silence, and a timeline that seemed too precise to be accidental. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. People close to her described her as routine-oriented, predictable, careful, the type of person whose days followed familiar patterns. She returned calls, followed schedules, stayed connected to family. Those details may sound ordinary, but in disappearance cases, ordinary behavior becomes extremely important because routine creates stability, and stability makes disruption easier to notice. That is exactly what happened here. The night Nancy disappeared did not begin dramatically. There were no public signs of conflict, no visible fear, nothing suggesting that hours later the case would become national news. Earlier that evening, she spent time with family before returning home. The neighborhood appeared calm, the streets quiet, the kind of quiet people trust too easily. And maybe that is the first unsettling truth in this story. Danger rarely looks dramatic before it happens. Most people imagine crime arriving loudly, fast, chaotic, but many real investigations begin differently, with ordinary moments, routine evenings, familiar environments. Then one tiny shift changes everything. In Nancy's case, that shift appears to have happened sometime after midnight. At first, nobody noticed. Why would they? The house looked normal from the outside. No alarms screaming, no immediate emergency calls. The neighborhood continued sleeping while something inside the timeline quietly broke apart. Then investigators discovered something strange. The security camera outside Nancy's house stopped functioning properly during the night. Not because of weather, not because of obvious technical failure. Someone appeared to interfere with visibility around the camera itself. That detail alone transformed the investigation. Because accidents do not usually target surveillance, people do. And once investigators realized the camera issue might be intentional, the entire atmosphere of the case changed. Then came another detail. Motion was reportedly detected near the property during the same general time window. Then another disruption appeared. Nancy's medical monitoring system failed to send its scheduled signal. That sequence became the center of everything. Because investigators now had three unusual events connected to the same stretch of time: camera interference, movement near the property, medical communication failure. Individually, each detail might seem explainable. Together, they form pattern. And patterns are what investigators trust when certainty is missing. At first, authorities still kept multiple possibilities open. Perhaps Nancy became disoriented. Perhaps she wandered away. Perhaps there had been a medical emergency unrelated to criminal activity. Those are reasonable starting points in many elderly missing person cases. But here's the problem. Nothing about the scene behaved naturally afterward. No clear trail outward. No immediate sightings nearby. No evidence suggesting an elderly woman simply walked away into the night alone. Instead, the timeline kept pointing back toward the house itself, toward those missing nighttime minutes, toward whatever happened after visibility disappeared. And once that happened, the investigation stopped feeling like a missing persons case. It started feeling like a controlled event. One of the most psychologically disturbing elements of this case is the behavior of the figure. Seen outside the property, the individual did not appear frantic, not rushed, not reckless. That matters more than most people realize. Behavior reveals mindset. An impulsive offender behaves differently than a prepared one. Impulsive behavior creates noise, mistakes, visible panic. Prepared behavior minimizes all three. And many observers who studied the footage noticed something deeply uncomfortable. The person outside the property moved with patience, almost as if they believed they had time. That is not the atmosphere most people associate with random crime. And when a crime feels patient, investigators begin considering planning. Planning changes everything, because planning suggests intention existed before the event itself. Which raises another question. Why Nancy? That question became unavoidable. Was this random targeting? A burglary that escalated unexpectedly? Or did someone specifically choose this victim, this location, and this timing? Investigators rarely reveal every theory publicly in active cases, but people following the story began building their own interpretations immediately, and online attention exploded for one major reason. Nancy Guthrie was connected to a highly recognizable public figure that instantly transformed the case from local tragedy into national obsession. The internet amplified everything. Every update, every rumor, every image, every theory. And once public attention reaches that level, something interesting happens psychologically. People stop simply following the case. They begin emotionally participating in it. They replay timelines, analyze body language, search for inconsistencies, because unresolved mysteries create mental tension the human brain desperately wants to resolve, especially mysteries involving vulnerable victims. An elderly woman disappearing from inside her own home creates fear in a very specific way. It forces people to imagine their own relatives, their parents, grandparents, people living quietly inside ordinary neighborhoods. The case becomes personal, and personal fear spreads faster than curiosity. Meanwhile, investigators continued reconstructing Nancy's final known hours. Every movement mattered. Every interaction mattered. Every minute became important, because somewhere between normal routine and complete disappearance, something interrupted reality, and investigators needed to know exactly where that interruption happened. This is where timeline analysis becomes critical, because timelines expose pressure points, moments where stories stop fitting naturally together, moments where certainty weakens. And in the Nancy Guthrie investigation, the most important pressure point remained the same narrow overnight window, a short sequence where multiple unusual events occurred back to back. Many investigators believe truth often hides inside compressed time frames, because when several anomalies happen close together, coincidence becomes harder to accept. That does not automatically prove criminal intent, but it changes investigative direction, and direction matters. Once investigators begin treating a situation as potentially controlled rather than accidental, the entire strategy changes. Now they focus heavily on access, opportunity, visibility, behavior. Who understood the environment? Who knew routines? Who could move without attracting attention? Those questions become central, not because proximity proves guilt, but because proximity creates possibility. And possibility is where investigations begin. One detail that deeply affected public perception was the reported discovery of blood, evidence connected to Nancy near part of the property. That changed the emotional tone of the case immediately, because now people were no longer imagining confusion or wandering. Now they were imagining confrontation, even if brief, even if controlled. And controlled confrontation is terrifying because it suggests speed and efficiency. The idea that something violent could occur so quietly inside a calm residential area unsettled people across the country, especially because there still appeared to be so little visible chaos afterward. That contradiction became haunting. Usually violence leaves disorder behind, broken objects, noise, disruption. But this case seemed almost restrained, as if whatever happened unfolded quickly enough to prevent escalation. And that possibility led many observers toward darker conclusions. Could the offender have known exactly when Nancy would be alone? Could they have observed the property beforehand? Did they understand the layout, the timing, the camera placement? These theories gained momentum because the event itself appeared too efficient for pure randomness. Then another disturbing development intensified public fear even further. Additional reports emerged of suspicious masked individuals appearing in nearby areas after Nancy disappeared. Authorities never publicly confirmed a direct connection between every sighting and the case. But psychologically, the impact was enormous. Because once communities believe danger is moving silently nearby, fear changes shape. Every shadow becomes suspicious. Every unfamiliar vehicle feels threatening. People begin checking cameras constantly, sleeping lighter, trusting less. The neighborhood itself changed emotionally after the disappearance. And unresolved fear tends to spread far beyond the original crime scene. Meanwhile, investigators continued processing physical evidence, vehicle information, DNA analysis, surveillance review, digital tracing. Thousands of public tips flooded into the investigation, many useless, some potentially valuable, but still no complete breakthrough emerged publicly. And this is where unresolved investigations become emotionally exhausting for families, because public attention expects momentum, arrests, confessions, resolution. Real investigations often move slower, especially when evidence is fragmented, especially when offenders minimize mistakes, especially when the truth exists inside a very small and very controlled timeline. At this stage, another important psychological layer begins emerging: narrative control. Because in many criminal investigations, the event itself is only part of the story. The aftermath matters too. How confusion spreads, how theories multiply, how uncertainty delays clarity. Some offenders rely not only on action, but on the chaos that follows action, because confusion protects hidden truth. And confusion surrounded the Nancy Guthrie case almost immediately. There were ransom-related communications reported publicly, cryptocurrency demands, messages implying knowledge of the case. But uncertainty surrounded those communications as well. Were they authentic? Manipulative? Attention-seeking? Investigators had to consider every possibility carefully, and every additional unknown increased public tension. Because once a case accumulates enough uncertainty, people stop trusting appearances. They begin searching for hidden meaning in every detail. A delayed statement, a missing timestamp, a changed explanation. Everything starts feeling potentially important. And in unresolved mysteries, perception becomes powerful, not legally, but emotionally. The public begins constructing invisible narratives around visible facts. That process can help investigations sometimes, but it can also distort them, because speculation grows faster than evidence. Still, one reality remained impossible to ignore. Nancy Guthrie was gone. An elderly woman disappeared from what should have been one of the safest environments imaginable, her own home. And despite enormous investigative effort, the timeline still contained gaps no public explanation had fully repaired. That is why this case continues haunting people. Not because of graphic violence, not because of dramatic crime scene imagery, but because of precision, because everything feels strangely measured. The camera issue, the timing, the silence, the narrow overnight window, the lack of obvious chaos. All of it creates one overwhelming psychological impression: control. And controlled disappearances frighten people differently than chaotic crimes, because they suggest patience, awareness, planning, the possibility that someone understood exactly how much time they needed, and exactly how little evidence they intended to leave behind. But almost every carefully controlled case eventually breaks for one reason. Human beings are imperfect. No matter how calm someone appears, mistakes happen. Tiny ones, invisible at first. A movement caught in reflection, a timestamp overlooked, a partial DNA transfer, a behavioral inconsistency investigators notice months later. Sometimes cases remain unsolved for years, before one microscopic detail suddenly changes everything. And many people following the Nancy Guthrie case believe that moment may still come, because the story feels too close to completion, too close to coherence. Like investigators are staring at pieces that almost connect, but not fully yet. And until those pieces lock together, the case remains suspended between terrifying possibilities. If this was random, it was extraordinarily unusual. If it was targeted, investigators still have not publicly explained why. If it was planned, the offender demonstrated frightening patience and timing. And timing may ultimately become the key to everything. Because the most important question in this case may not be how someone approached the house, but how they knew the exact moment to do it. That question still hangs over the investigation. An elderly woman returns home. The neighborhood sleeps. A figure appears outside. The camera loses visibility. Movement is detected. The medical signal stops. And then, Nancy Guthrie disappears completely. No verified public explanation has yet connected those moments into one clear narrative. Only fragments. And fragments create obsession, because unfinished stories keep the human mind searching long after logic says to stop. That may be the final reason this case continues gripping people everywhere. Not because they understand what happened, but because they feel that the answer is hidden, somewhere inside those missing nighttime minutes, waiting for one final detail to expose it.